The city woke up before Sarah Bennett ever did. Paris always did. It stirred itself awake in slow, deliberate movements, as if it knew it had nowhere else to be. The streets breathed in the early hours, exhaling damp air that smelled of stone, metal, and yesterday's rain. Streetlights flickered above empty sidewalks, reluctant to surrender their watch. Somewhere in the distance, a delivery truck hissed to a stop, and a CAF door opened too early, its bell ringing into the cold like a question no one was ready to answer. Sarah stood at the bus stop with her hands folded inside the sleeves of a coat that had once belonged to someone else. The fabric was too thin for the season, the lining worn smooth by years of use, but she did not shiver. She had learned how to ration warmth, how to pull it inward and keep it there, how to save it for when it mattered. Her breath formed small clouds in the air, steady and controlled, each one released with care. The glass of the shelter reflected her face faintly, pale, composed, a face that had learned restraint the way other people learned laughter. Her hair was tied back neatly, not for vanity, but for efficiency. Nothing about her appearance asked to be noticed. That, too, was intentional. She watched the city move without her. Couples hurried past with collars raised. A man jogged by, his shoes splashing through shallow puddles. A woman stood across the street smoking her first cigarette of the day, eyes half closed, as if bracing herself for the hours ahead. Paris flowed around Sarah like a river, and she stood still within it, unseen, enduring the current rather than fighting it. When the bus arrived, she stepped on quietly, paid in exact change, and took the same seat she always took, third from the back on the left side, close enough to the exit to leave without delay, far enough from the driver to avoid conversation. The bus lurched forward, and she let her head rest lightly against the window, watching buildings slide past in muted shades of gray and beige. The restaurant would open in an hour. That was enough time. It always had to be. The apartment she had left behind was awake too, though not in the way most homes were. There was no radio murmuring background noise, no television offering hollow comfort. Silence lived there by design. Sarah had learned that sound could be cruel when someone could not respond to it. Her father lay in the bedroom she passed every morning, the door always open. He was awake. He always was. His eyes followed her as she moved through the hallway earlier that morning, slipping on her shoes, tying the laces with careful precision. She had paused in the doorway and met his gaze, just as she did every day. A glance, a nod, a moment that carried everything they never said out loud. She adjusted the blanket at his shoulders, smoothing it as if order alone might restore something that had been taken. The room smelled faintly of antiseptic and old books, a combination that no longer felt strange to her. He had once been a tall man, broad-shouldered, commanding without effort. In lecture halls, silence had fallen when he spoke, not because he demanded it, but because people wanted to listen. Now his body was still. Only his eyes moved, sharp and alert, impossibly alive within the immobility that trapped him. "I'll be late tonight," she had whispered, leaning close so he would not have to strain. "There's a reservation." His fingers had twitched slightly, barely more than a thought made visible. Enough for her to see, enough for her to understand. She had smiled then, not the practiced smile she gave customers, but the softer one that belonged only to this room. "I know," she had said. "I'll bring soup." As she turned to leave, her foot brushed against a cardboard box tucked beneath the desk. It shifted just enough to reveal the corner of yellowed paper, and for a moment the pass reached for her. A Sorbonne letterhead. Dense handwriting in the margins. footnotes stacked like scaffolding, supporting ideas that had once been strong enough to change lives. A future that had almost existed. Sarah nudged the box back into the shadows with the edge of her shoe. Some doors were easier to survive if they stayed closed. The bus slowed as it neared her stop. She pulled the cord, stood and stepped back out into the cold. The restaurant sat on a quiet street just off the river, its windows tall and narrow, framed in black iron that gleamed even on gray days. From the outside, it promised warmth and elegance. Soft golden light spilling onto wet pavement, offering comfort to those who had learned to expect it. Inside, the air was different, controlled, measured, heavy with anticipation. Sarah entered through the staff door at the back, greeted by the familiar sounds of preparation. Cutlery clinked softly as it was arranged with obsessive precision. Glassware was polished until it caught the light just right. The scent of butter, herbs, and simmering stock hung in the air, rich and comforting in a way that felt almost cruel to someone who rarely had time to enjoy it. She changed quickly, slipping into her uniform as if into another skin. Black dress, white apron, hair secured. She checked her reflection once, not to admire but to correct. Straighten the collar, smooth the fabric, erase anything that might suggest fatigue or worry. Customers did not tip well for visible humanity. The dining room was still empty, but it felt expectant, like a stage waiting for its actors. Tables were set with crisp white linens, each fold deliberate, each fork aligned perfectly. Candles stood unlit, ready to glow later in the evening when conversation would grow louder and secrets would feel safer to share. Sarah moved through the room, checking place settings, adjusting chairs, ensuring symmetry. There was comfort in the ritual, in tasks that had clear rules and immediate results. The world outside might be uncertain, but here order could be imposed even if only temporarily. The manager emerged from his office, already tense, his smile rehearsed. "We have a full house tonight," he said, as if announcing bad weather. "And a VIP," the word settled heavily in the room. VIPs meant scrutiny. They meant unreasonable expectations and unforgiving judgments. They meant a single mistake could ripple outward, touching schedules, tips, shifts, and livelihoods. Sarah nodded once. She always did as the doors opened and the first guests began to arrive. The restaurant filled with low conversation and the rustle of coats being removed. Laughter surfaced, tentative at first, then bolder. The candles were lit, their flames reflected in polished glass and silver. The room warmed, not just with heat but with presence. Sarah moved among the tables with practiced grace, greeting guests, pouring water, offering menus. Her voice was calm, neutral, pleasant without being personal. She had learned how to be present without being seen, how to listen without reacting, how to absorb impatience, entitlement, and indifference without letting any of it touch the fragile core she guarded so carefully. She noticed him the moment he entered. Not because he was loud. He wasn't. Not because he demanded attention. He didn't need to. The room seemed to adjust itself around him, conversations dipping slightly, glances flicking toward the entrance before returning to plates and glasses. He wore his wealth the way some men wore cologne, subtle but unmistakable. His suit was tailored to his body with surgical precision. His movements were unhurried, confident in the way only people accustomed to being obeyed could be. Marcus Sterling. She did not know his name yet, but she knew his type. Men like him carried themselves as if the world had been arranged for their convenience. They spoke as though they expected agreement, and when it did not come, they were genuinely surprised. The hostess guided him to a table near the center of the room, a location that offered both visibility and control. He sat, surveyed his surroundings, and gave a small nod, as if approving of the space. The manager's gaze flicked toward Sarah. "Table 12, he said quietly. "You." Something tightened in her chest, an instinct she had learned to trust. She nodded again, picked up a menu, and approached the table. As she stopped beside him, she felt his attention settle on her, not unkindly, but with curiosity sharpened by boredom. He looked up slowly, taking in details others often missed. The way she stood, the way she held the menu, the absence of nerves where he might have expected them. "Good evening," she said. Her voice was steady, warm enough to be professional, distant enough to be safe. "May I start you with something to drink?" He studied her for a moment longer than necessary, then smiled, a small, knowing curve of the lips. "I'll be ordering in French," he said lightly. "I assume that won't be a problem." The words were polite. The implication was not. Sarah felt the familiar weight settle on her shoulders, the quiet burden of survival, of endurance, of carrying more than anyone in this room could possibly imagine. She met his gaze without flinching, her expression unchanged. "Of course," she replied, and somewhere deep inside her, a door she had kept closed for years stirred, just slightly, as if listening. The word "of course" lingered between them for a fraction of a second longer than it should have. Sarah felt it settle, felt the way Marcus Sterling measured it, weighed it, tested its texture as if language itself were a game he expected to win. His smile did not widen. It sharpened. "Excellent," he said, switching effortlessly into French, his tone smooth, practiced. "In that case, I'll begin with a recommendation. Something traditional, but authentic." Sarah inclined her head slightly, acknowledging the request without comment. She did not rush him. Wealthy men like Marcus noticed rushing. They mistook patience for submission and submission for weakness. Around them, the restaurant continued its quiet choreography. Servers moved like shadows between tables. Glasses were filled. Cutlery sang softly against porcelain. Yet Sarah could feel it, the subtle tightening of the room, the way attention bent almost imperceptibly toward table 12. Power had a gravity to it. People sensed it before they understood it. Marcus leaned back in his chair, one arm resting casually along the back, his posture relaxed, in the way of someone who had never been told to sit up straight. He began to speak again, this time in a French that was deliberately ornate, laced with archaic phrasing and regional inflections that belonged more to history books than modern conversation. The words rolled from his tongue slowly, deliberately, as if he wanted each one to land with weight. Sarah listened. She did not interrupt. She did not nod too quickly. She let him finish. Inside her mind, the sentences unfolded with effortless clarity. She heard not just what he said, but what he meant to do. The dialect was old, aristocratic, once spoken in salons where power was inherited and cruelty wore lace gloves. It was not commonly taught. It was not necessary, which was precisely why he used it. A weapon disguised as refinement. He paused at the end of his order, watching her closely now, eyes flicking to her face, searching for hesitation, for the smallest crack. The silence stretched just enough to feel uncomfortable. "Do you need me to repeat anything?" he asked, still in French, his voice polite, almost generous. Sarah met his gaze. Her expression remained neutral, but something in her eyes shifted, a subtle recalibration. She recognized the challenge for what it was. Not a misunderstanding. A performance. "No," she replied calmly, still in English. "I understood. Marcus's eyebrow lifted a fraction. Amusement flickered there, tinged with skepticism. "Good," he said, switching back to English as well. "Then I trust you'll get it right." "I always do," Sarah said, and this time there was no apology in her voice. She turned smoothly, moving away from the table with measured steps. She could feel his eyes on her back as she walked, assessing, recalculating. Men like Marcus were not accustomed to uncertainty. They preferred people to fit neatly into categories: useful, impressive, disposable. Sarah did not fit yet, and that unsettled him. At the service station, another server glanced at her, eyebrows raised just slightly. "Everything okay?" she whispered. Sarah nodded. "Fine." She began writing down the order, her hand steady, her pen moving without pause. The words he had spoken replayed in her mind, each phrase precise, familiar in a way that tugged at memories she rarely allowed to surface. She had learned that dialect once, long ago, not for display, but for love. Her father's voice echoed faintly in her thoughts, correcting her pronunciation with patient amusement, explaining the social history behind each expression. Language was never just language to him. It was power. It was identity. It was inheritance. She shook the memory away and focused on the present. Plates were assembled. The kitchen hummed with controlled urgency. Orders were called, repeated, confirmed. Life went on. When she returned to Marcus's table with his drink, he looked up as if surprised she had not vanished already. He said. She placed the glass in front of him with perfect alignment, the base landing softly against the tablecloth. "You didn't specify ice," she said evenly, "so I assumed you preferred it as intended." Another pause. "Shorter this time." "Correct," he said. "Most people wouldn't know that." "I try not to be most people," Sarah replied before she could stop herself. The words were out, hanging between them, too sharp to retract. For a heartbeat, she wondered if she had overstepped, if fatigue had dulled her usual caution. Marcus laughed, a low, controlled sound that drew a few glances from nearby tables. "Interesting," he said. "And here I thought I was just having dinner." She did not respond. She did not need to. Silence, she had learned, was often more effective than defense. As she turned to leave again, she felt it a shift. His interest had sharpened. What had begun as casual amusement was becoming something else. Curiosity, perhaps, or irritation. It was hard to tell with men, who were used to getting exactly what they wanted. From the corner of the room, the manager watched closely, his smile tightening whenever Marcus spoke. He adjusted his tie, smoothed his jacket, and hovered in the way people did when proximity to power felt like safety. Marcus noticed, too. He glanced toward the manager, then back at Sarah. "You've been here long?" he asked, his tone conversational. "Long enough," she replied, "and before that." She met his eyes again, offering him nothing. "Is there anything else you'd like to order?" He smiled, slow and deliberate. "Not yet." She moved away once more, her pulse steady but alert. She was aware now of the invisible line between them, the quiet escalation neither of them acknowledged openly. He had come here expecting obedience, perhaps mild entertainment. He had not expected resistance, especially not the quiet kind. At a nearby table, a couple whispered to each other, glancing in Marcus's direction. His presence was magnetic, drawing attention even when he was not speaking. Wealth did that. It bent space around itself. Sarah retreated briefly into the kitchen, letting the noise and heat ground her. She leaned against the counter for just a second longer than necessary, inhaling deeply. Her reflection stared back at her from the stainless steel surface, fragmented and distorted. She barely recognized the woman there. The past pressed closer now, emboldened by the present. The memory of lecture halls filled with murmurs. The weight of books in her hands. The certainty she had once carried so easily, before life had narrowed her world to survival and sacrifice. She straightened, pushing the thoughts away. This was not the time. This was never the time. When she returned with the first course, Marcus was watching her again, this time without bothering to hide it. She set the plate down, describing the dish succinctly, professionally. He listened, then waved a dismissive hand. In French he said, "There it was." The escalation made explicit, Sarah's fingers tightened almost imperceptibly around the tray. Around them, the restaurant seemed to hold its breath. A few diners leaned in, pretending not to listen. She looked at him, truly looked at him now. At the confidence carved into his features. At the ease with which he assumed superiority. At the faint impatience in his eyes, as if daring her to fail. Her mind raced not with fear, but with calculation. She could deflect. She could apologize. She could retreat into the safe anonymity she had built so carefully. It would be easier, safer, but something inside her stirred again, stronger this time. A memory of her father's voice, firm and gentle all at once. Never let someone make you smaller by pretending knowledge belongs to them. She inhaled slowly, and then she began to speak. Not yet with the full force she was capable of. Not yet with the precision that would come later. But with enough fluency, enough quiet authority, to make the room shift. She described the dish in French, her pronunciation clean, her syntax elegant. She did not embellish. She did not rush. She spoke as someone who belonged to the language, not as someone borrowing it. Marcus's smile faltered. Just for a fraction of a second. Sarah finished, placed the tray down, and waited. "Well," he said finally, recovering quickly. "You surprise me." She inclined her head. "I find surprises are often mutual." As she walked away, the murmur in the room rose slightly, conversation resuming with new energy. Something had changed. Not dramatically. Not yet. But the first crack had appeared. Marcus Sterling watched her go, his expression thoughtful now. The beginnings of something like doubt creeping in at the edges of his confidence, and Sarah, moving back into the rhythm of the restaurant, felt the weight on her shoulders shift. It was still heavy. It always would be. But beneath it, something else stirred, a sense of balance, long forgotten, and the quiet, dangerous realization that this man's power might not be as absolute as he believed. The moment lingered after Sarah walked away, thin as a held breath. Marcus Sterling did not return immediately to his meal. He sat back in his chair, fingers resting lightly against the stem of his glass. Eyes following her, she blended once more into the careful choreography of the restaurant. Around him, conversation resumed, but it did so unevenly, like an orchestra that had briefly lost its conductor. He had not expected that. Not the fluency. Not the composure. Not the way she had spoken as if French were not a trick she had memorized, but a landscape she had grown up inside. It unsettled him in a way he did not immediately understand, and because he did not understand it, he did not like it. Marcus was a man accustomed to clarity. Markets rose and fell for reasons he could explain. People deferred because they always did. Intelligence, he believed, was something you displayed, something you wielded. It was meant to be visible, audible, impressive. Sarah's intelligence had not tried to impress him at all. That, more than anything, irritated him. When she returned to the service station, Another server leaned toward her and murmured something she did not quite hear. Sarah shook her head gently, a silent request not to make it a conversation. She kept moving. Movement, she had learned, was safety. Stillness invited scrutiny, yet she could feel it now, the invisible thread connecting her back to table 12. Marcus had shifted from casual amusement to intent observation. The weight of it pressed lightly between her shoulder blades, not heavy enough to force her to react, but present enough to demand awareness. She had crossed an unseen line. Not by defying him openly, but by failing to behave as he expected her to. The kitchen doors swung open and shut as plates went out. Orders were called. Sauces spooned with meticulous care. The head chef barked instructions, his voice sharp but contained. Everything here functioned on hierarchy and precision. Sarah understood that world. She lived in it. What she understood less was the world Marcus Sterling came from, where hierarchy was assumed and precision was optional because mistakes could always be absorbed by money. She finished serving another table and felt, rather than saw, the manager approach. "Everything all right?" he asked quietly, his tone carefully neutral. "Yes," Sarah replied. "Why wouldn't it be?" He hesitated, glancing toward Marcus's table. "Just be careful. Careful." The word followed her as she returned to table 12 with the second course. Marcus looked up as she approached, his expression already composed, any earlier surprise neatly folded away. He smiled at her, but this time the smile carried intent. "Tell me," he said conversationally, "where did you learn French like that?" Sarah placed the plate down with practiced ease. "I grew up here," he said. "Of course. That explains some of it. Some of it." The implication hung there, casual and dismissive, as if fluency was something acquired accidentally, like an accent picked up from the street. She did not correct him. Marcus took a bite, chewed thoughtfully, then nodded once. "Acceptable," he said. "Though the seasoning could be more restrained." "I'll pass that along," Sarah replied, though she knew better than to relay criticism delivered purely for dominance. He dabbed his mouth with a napkin and leaned back again. "You know," he continued, "most people claim to speak French. Very few actually do." Her gaze flickered up, steady. "Language is about use, not claims." His eyes narrowed slightly. "That's an interesting way to put it." Silence stretched between them again, but this time it was different. It was not awkward. It was deliberate. Marcus was recalibrating, adjusting his approach the way a predator adjusted its stance when prey did not flee. He switched languages without warning, not into standard French, not into the polished modern version spoken on television or in business meetings. He dipped instead into something older, heavier. His pronunciation exaggerated just enough to draw attention. The dialect carried echoes of provincial estates and inherited titles, of a time when words were shaped by power rather than accessibility. Several heads turned. Even those who did not understand sensed the shift. The way the sound itself changed texture. Sarah felt it instantly. Her body reacted before her mind did. A small tightening in her chest, a flicker of something dangerously close to recognition. This was not casual. This was not a test of competence. This was an attempt at exposure. Marcus spoke slowly, savoring the syllables, layering them with subtle errors that only someone deeply familiar with the dialect would notice. He asked a question that was not really a question, phrased in a way that assumed the listener would either nod politely or falter completely. It was a trap built from elegance. Sarah stood very still. Inside her mind, The words unfolded with crystalline clarity. She heard not only what he said, but what he had meant to say. She caught the misused honorific, the slightly incorrect verb tense, the regional inflection that did not quite belong to the area he was imitating. Her father's voice surfaced unbidden, patient and precise. He had loved this dialect, loved its contradictions. He had taught it not as a novelty, but as a case study in how language preserved social violence long after the systems that created it had supposedly collapsed. She had been young then, brilliant, certain. She was neither young nor certain. Now, Marcus finished speaking and waited. The silence stretched a beat too long. 2. Sarah knew what everyone else in the room saw. A waitress confronted with a language she could not possibly understand. A pause that would soon be followed by an apology, perhaps an embarrassed laugh, a retreat into safer territory. She felt the old reflex rise, the instinct to make herself smaller, to smooth the moment over. Survival demanded that skill. It had demanded it for years, but something in Marcus's expression stopped her. There was satisfaction there. Anticipation. Not curiosity, but confidence. He had already decided how this would end. The decision, once made, was irreversible. Sarah inhaled slowly. She did not rush. She did not glance toward the manager or the kitchen. She kept her gaze on Marcus, steady and level, and when she spoke, she did so in the same dialect he had used. Her voice was calm, measured, unadorned. She answered his question precisely, correcting his misused term not by pointing it out directly, but by responding with the proper construction, elegant and unmistakable. She adjusted the rhythm slightly, smoothing the roughness of his phrasing, restoring the dialect to its intended form. She did not perform. She spoke as if this were ordinary. As if she had done this her entire life. The effect was immediate. Marcus blinked once. Just once. His fingers tightened around the napkin. Around them, the restaurant fell into a peculiar stillness. The kind that settled not because someone had demanded attention, but because everyone sensed something had shifted. Sarah continued, adding a brief clarification, her tone respectful but firm. She explained the origin of the expression he had used, noting its historical context with the ease of someone who had studied it deeply. There was no condescension in her voice, no triumph, only accuracy. When she finished, she stopped speaking and waited. Marcus stared at her. For a moment, the mask slipped. Not fully, but enough. Confusion flickered across his face, followed by something darker. His mouth curved into a smile again, but it was tighter now, less natural. Well, he said finally, switching back to English with deliberate ease. I see I underestimated you. Sarah inclined her head. It happens. A ripple of quiet reaction passed through nearby tables. A raised eyebrow. A glance exchanged. The room had felt the exchange, even if most did not understand it. Marcus laughed softly, too softly. You should be careful, he said lightly. People don't always appreciate being corrected. I wasn't correcting you, Sarah replied. I was answering. Another pause. Marcus studied her now as if seeing her for the first time, not as a role, but as a variable, something unaccounted for. He did not like variables. Where did you study? He asked abruptly. Sarah's chest tightened. The question cut closer than the others, slicing past the performance and into something real. She hesitated, just enough to notice it herself. Here, she said again. In Paris. That's not what I asked. She met his gaze. It's the answer I'm giving. The challenge was quiet, but unmistakable. Marcus leaned back, exhaling slowly through his nose. For a moment, he seemed to consider pushing further, to force the confrontation he had so carefully engineered. Then, unexpectedly, he waved a hand dismissively. "No matter," he said. "It's refreshing, in its own way." Sarah did not trust the tone. Men like Marcus did not abandon games. They simply changed strategies. She cleared the table smoothly, efficiently, her movements unhurried. As she turned away, she was aware of the subtle tremor in her hands, the delayed reaction of adrenaline released too late. She flexed her fingers, grounding herself in the physicality of the task. Behind her, Marcus Sterling watched her go, his mind no longer on the food in front of him. He replayed the exchange, analyzing it the way he analyzed deals, searching for leverage, for advantage, and for the first time in a long while, he came up empty. Sarah disappeared into the flow of the restaurant, her heart steady now, her steps sure. The weapon he had wielded so casually had failed him. Worse, it had revealed something he had not intended to show, that power, when challenged quietly and precisely, could falter, and that the woman he had tried to humiliate was far more dangerous than she appeared. The restaurant never truly returned to its previous rhythm after that exchange. Conversation resumed, yes, but it did so cautiously, like water flowing around a newly discovered crack. Sarah felt it as she moved between tables, an undercurrent of attention that had not been there before. It followed her in fragments. A glance held too long, a whisper cut short when she passed. The faint tension that lingered in the air like static after a storm. At tea table 12. Marcus Sterling sat quietly. He no longer spoke to fill space. He observed. The meal progressed, course by course, but his appetite had shifted. Food became secondary. What interested him now was the anomaly standing a few meters away, pouring wine for another guest with the same calm precision she had shown all evening. She did not glance in his direction. She did not check for his reaction. She behaved as though nothing unusual had happened. That, more than her fluency, unsettled him. Men like Marcus were accustomed to impact. They expected their presence to alter rooms, to bend conversations, to provoke reactions. Resistance was familiar, but it was usually loud, emotional, gratifying in its predictability. Sarah's resistance was none of those things. It was quiet, controlled, and disturbingly complete. He signaled her again, not with a raised hand, just a slight movement of his fingers, subtle but unmistakable. A command disguised as convenience. Sarah felt it immediately. She turned, collected herself, and approached the table with the same unhurried grace she had maintained all night. "Yes?" she asked. Marcus rested his elbows lightly on the table, leaning forward just enough to suggest intimacy without offering it. "I've been thinking," he said. "You speak French beautifully. But speaking isn't the same as understanding." She met his gaze. "No," she agreed. "It isn't." A flicker of satisfaction crossed his face. He had found the opening he was looking for. "Then indulge me," he said. "Let's have a real conversation." He did not wait for her consent. This time, when he switched into French, he went further. He abandoned modern constructions entirely, slipping into an aristocratic dialect so rare it was barely spoken outside academic circles. The syntax was elaborate, the vocabulary steeped in class and control, each phrase constructed to display dominance rather than communicate meaning. It was the language of salons and salons alone, once used to exclude as much as to impress. He spoke slowly, savoring the sound of his own voice, layering it with confidence. He referenced abstract concepts, social hierarchies, intellectual superiority. The words were chosen carefully, not for clarity, but for intimidation. Several diners nearby stopped pretending not to listen. Sarah felt the weight of the moment settle fully now. This was no longer a private exchange. Marcus had widened the stage. He wanted witnesses. Her mind moved faster than her body betrayed. She translated instantly, effortlessly, catching not just the meaning, but the intent behind each phrase. He was baiting her, daring her to reveal the limits of her knowledge in front of an audience that had already begun to categorize her. Waitress, service staff, decorative background. She remained still as he finished, her posture relaxed, her hands resting lightly at her sides. The silence that followed stretched, thick, and deliberate. Marcus smiled. "Well?" he prompted softly. For a brief, dangerous second, Sarah considered retreat. She could deflect. She could respond in simpler French, acknowledge the order and walk away. The night would continue. Her job would remain intact. Her father would still need her tomorrow, but something deeper stirred. Something older than fear. She remembered sitting at a small kitchen table years ago, her legs too short to reach the floor, listening as her father spoke about language as a mirror of power, about how certain dialects were designed not to communicate, but to intimidate, about how silence was often mistaken for ignorance, and ignorance weaponized by those who needed it to feel superior. She remembered his hands then, expressive and sure, sketching ideas in the air as if language itself was something tangible. She remembered the pride in his eyes the first time she corrected him. Sarah lifted her chin when she spoke. She did so in the same dialect Marcus had used. But her version was different, cleaner, more precise. She did not mimic his cadence. She refined it. She corrected his mispronunciation without drawing attention to it, reshaped his sentence structures subtly, restoring them to their original elegance. Her voice was steady, confident, and hurried. She did not raise it. She did not soften it. She spoke as an equal. The effect was immediate and absolute. The room fell silent. Cutlery paused midair. A glass hovered just short of a table. Conversations died in unfinished fragments. Even those who did not understand the words felt the shift, the unmistakable sensation of witnessing a reversal. Sarah continued, expanding on his point with clarity and depth. She referenced historical context, not to show off, but because it was relevant. She corrected a conceptual error he had embedded in his question, dismantling it piece by piece with calm logic. There was no malice in her tone, no satisfaction, only truth. Marcus's expression froze. For the first time that evening, he did not immediately recover. His eyes flicked briefly to the surrounding tables, registering the attention he had invited and now could not control. His jaw tightened, just slightly. Sarah finished speaking and stopped. She did not fill the silence. She let it do the work for her. Seconds passed. Then Marcus laughed out. It was louder than necessary. A sharp sound that broke the stillness, but did not erase it. "Well played," he said in English, his tone light but strained. "I didn't realize I was dining with a scholar." Sarah met his gaze evenly. "You're dining with someone who understands you," she said. "There's a difference." A murmur rippled through the room. Not applause. Not approval. Something quieter. Recognition. Marcus leaned back in his chair, crossing his arms loosely as if the posture alone could restore balance. "You should be careful," he said again, but this time the warning lacked conviction. "People don't like being exposed." "I wasn't exposing you," Sarah replied. "You chose the language. I chose to answer." Another pause. This one belonged to Marcus. He studied her openly now, no longer pretending indifference. He was recalculating, reclassifying. The waitress had become something else in his mind, something inconvenient. "Tell me your name," he said. She hesitated for the briefest moment. Names had power. They made things personal. They made them real. "Sarah," she said. "Sarah Bennett." He nodded slowly, committing it to memory. "Well, Sarah Bennett," he said, "you've made this evening far more interesting than I anticipated." She inclined her head, professional to the end. "Is there anything else I can bring you?" He waved a hand dismissively. "No, I think I've had enough." As she turned to leave, she felt it fully now, the shift not just in the room, but in herself. The weight she carried had not vanished, but it had redistributed. Something long dormant had straightened its spine. Behind her, Marcus Sterling remained seated, staring down at his untouched plate. The arrogance that had brought him here had not disappeared, but it had been wounded. And arrogance, when wounded, remembered. Sarah moved back into the flow of the restaurant, her heart steady, her mind clear. She did not know what this encounter would cost her, or what it would awaken in the man she had just challenged, but she knew one thing with certainty. The night had crossed a point of no return, and the language he had chosen as a weapon had become the blade that cut deepest into him. The room never fully recovered its balance after that. It tried. Conversations restarted in softer tones. Laughter returned, but it arrived late, like an understudy stepping onto a stage after the lead actor had faltered. People pretended to refocus on their plates, on their companions, on the safety of ordinary things. Yet the exchange lingered, suspended in the air, invisible but undeniable. Sarah felt it as she moved. The way eyes followed her now, not with entitlement, not with dismissal, but with something closer to curiosity. She had been background noise moments ago. Now she was a question. She hated that feeling. Attention was dangerous. It brought scrutiny. Scrutiny brought consequences. She had built her life around avoiding both. At table 12, Marcus Sterling sat unusually still. His posture remained relaxed, but the ease had shifted. What had once been effortless now required maintenance. He swirled the remaining wine in his glass without drinking it, watching the liquid climb and fall against crystal walls as if measuring something internal. He replayed the moment again and again. Not the embarrassment he had trained himself long ago to endure, but the precision of it. The way she had dismantled his performance without ever raising her voice. The way she had made him feel, briefly and unmistakably, unprepared. That was rare. Marcus had built his life on being prepared. He signaled Sarah again, this time more openly. She noticed immediately. She always did. Her steps slowed just slightly before she turned, a controlled adjustment that allowed her to collect herself before re-entering his gravity. "Yes?" she asked, her tone unchanged. He gestured to the chair across from him. "Sit." The word landed heavy. Not a request. A reflexive command issued without thought. Sarah did not sit. "I'm working," she said calmly. For a fraction of a second, irritation flashed across his face. Then he smiled, correcting himself. "Of course," he said. "Then stand. But indulge me." Indulge. Another word chosen carefully. She remained where she was, hands folded neatly in front of her apron, posture straight but unyielding. She met his eyes without challenge, without deference. "You said you understood me," Marcus continued. "That interests me." "Understanding doesn't require agreement," Sarah replied. "True," he said. "But it does require intelligence." There it was. The hook. Most people reached for validation without realizing it. Sarah had learned, painfully, how not to. She said nothing. Marcus leaned forward again, lowering his voice slightly. drawing the conversation inward. "You don't belong here," he said, not unkindly. Not really. The words should have stuck. Once, they would have. Instead, they slid past her defenses, dulled by repetition. Too many people had said versions of that sentence to count. "You don't know where I belong," she replied. He studied her face, searching for cracks. "I know potential when I see it." Sarah's mouth curved into the faintest suggestion of a smile, gone almost before it appeared. "Most people think they do." His laugh came easier this time, more genuine. "You're not easy to categorize." "I don't try to be," she said. "That's a mistake," he replied. "Categories make life efficient. For whom?" she asked. The question hung there, simple and sharp. Marcus did not answer immediately. Instead, he leaned back and exhaled, as if conceding a point he had not expected to lose. "You remind me of someone," he said. Sarah's chest tightened, involuntarily. "I doubt that. Perhaps," he admitted. "But intelligence has patterns. Certain rhythms." Her father's voice stirred again, uninvited. She pushed it down hard. "Is there something else you need?" she asked. "Dessert, perhaps?" He shook his head slowly. "No, I think I've had enough for one evening." The words carried weight beyond their literal meaning. Sarah inclined her head and turned away before he could say more. She felt relief as she stepped out of his immediate orbit, but it was tempered by unease. Conversations like that did not end cleanly. They lingered, evolved, returned when least expected. As she moved toward the service station, she caught the manager's eye. His expression was tight, uncertain. He beckoned her over. "What was that?" he whispered sharply once she was close. "A conversation," Sarah replied. "With him?" The manager hissed. "You don't have conversations with people like that." "I was polite," she said. "That's not the point," he snapped, then softened slightly. "Just don't provoke him." "I didn't," she said quietly. "He did." The manager stared at her for a long moment, then shook his head and walked away, muttering under his breath. Sarah remained still, grounding herself in the familiar hum of the restaurant, the heat from the kitchen, the weight of the tray in her hands, the rhythm of service. She needed the night to end. She needed normalcy to reassert itself. At tea table 12, Marcus rose from his chair. The movement drew attention again. He slipped on his coat with practiced ease, adjusting the cuffs of his sleeves as if nothing unusual had occurred. He placed a card on the table, weighed down by his glass, when Sarah returned to clear the table. She noticed it immediately. He had not waited for the check. She picked up the card, her fingers brushing its smooth surface. Black, minimalist. His name embossed in silver. Understated and confident. Marcus Sterling. There was no note, no explanation, only the implication. She slid the card into the pocket of her apron without comment. From across the room, Marcus paused near the exit and glanced back once. Their eyes met. His expression was unreadable now, a careful mask rebuilt from experience. He inclined his head slightly, not quite a nod, not quite a farewell. Then he was gone. The doors closed behind him, and the restaurant exhaled. The tension did not vanish, but it loosened, like a knot finally given permission to exist. Voices rose. Laughter returned more freely. Plates were cleared. Wine was poured. The night resumed its expected shape. Sarah moved through the remainder of her shift on instinct alone. Her body knew what to do even as her mind replayed every word, every glance. She worked until her feet ached and her shoulders burned, until the last guest departed and the candles were snuffed out one by one. When she finally stepped back outside, The air was colder than before. Paris had settled into itself again, quieter now, reflective. The river moved dark and steady nearby, carrying secrets no one asked it to keep. She walked toward the bus stop, coat pulled tight around her, Marcus's card heavy in her pocket. She told herself she would throw it away, that it meant nothing, that men like him passed through lives without consequence all the time. Yet as the bus approached, its headlights cutting through the night, she knew that something had shifted, not dramatically, not visibly, but enough. Marcus Sterling had not left with satisfaction. He had left with curiosity, and curiosity, when paired with pride, was far more dangerous than arrogance alone. The bus ride home felt longer than usual. Sarah sat in her usual seat, third from the back, left side, Marcus Sterling's card resting like a secret against her hip. The city slid past in streaks of amber and shadow, storefronts closing, shutters lowering, reflections shivering in the river. Paris at night had a way of looking honest. Stripped of its daytime performance, it revealed the bones beneath the beauty. She pressed her forehead lightly to the cool glass and closed her eyes. Curiosity, the word followed her. Unwelcome. Marcus had not been humiliated in the way lesser men would have been. He had not lashed out or stormed away. He had studied her. That was worse. Men who studied came back prepared. The bus jerked to a stop. She stood, adjusted her coat, and stepped out into the narrow street that led to her apartment. The building's facade was worn, the paint peeling in places, the stairwell light flickering faintly behind smudged glass. It was not elegant, not impressive, but it was stable. It held. Inside, the silence wrapped around her immediately. She removed her shoes by the door and walked softly down the hallway. Her father's room was lit by a small lamp near the bed, casting a warm, steady glow over shelves, lined with books that had not been touched in years, but still radiated presence. His eyes found her as soon as she entered. "I'm home," she said quietly. She crossed the room and leaned down to kiss his forehead. His skin was warm, familiar. His gaze searched her face with the same intensity it once reserved for manuscripts and lecture halls. "You would have enjoyed tonight," she murmured, pulling a chair closer to the bed. "You would have corrected him before I did." A flicker in his eyes. A spark. She hesitated. The card in her pocket felt heavier now. She withdrew it slowly and held it up so he could see. "Marcus Sterling," she read aloud. There was no immediate reaction. Why would there be? The name meant nothing yet, but something in her voice must have shifted, because his gaze sharpened. "He tried to embarrass me," she said, her tone steady but softer than before. "He chose an old dialect, aristocratic, overcomplicated. He wanted an audience." Her father's fingers twitched slightly against the blanket. "I answered," she continued. "He didn't like that." Silence settled between them, but it was not empty. It was filled with memory. Without fully deciding to, Sarah rose from the chair and crossed to the desk in the corner of the room. She knelt, pulling the cardboard box out from beneath it. Dust clung to the edges. The lid resisted for a moment before giving way. Inside lay a life paused mid-sentence. Stacks of papers, bound drafts, handwritten notes in ink that had faded but not surrendered. The Sorbonne letterhead sat near the top, official and heavy with promise. Beneath it, the early chapters of a thesis that had once been described as revolutionary. She lifted the first stack carefully and returned to the chair beside her father. "You remember," she whispered. Though she knew he did, the thesis had been his life's work. A linguistic framework exploring how language shaped economic power structures across centuries. It had been dense, meticulous, brilliant. It had challenged assumptions, threatened established narratives. It had also threatened careers. The accident had happened before its defense, a collision at an intersection. Rain, a driver who claimed he hadn't seen the light change. After that, everything had changed. Sarah began flipping through the pages slowly, scanning familiar passages, terminology she could recite by heart, structural theories that had once kept her awake at night in the best possible way. She had grown up inside these ideas, absorbing them the way other children absorbed fairy tales. Her own name appeared occasionally in the margins, scribbled beside references she had helped locate, translations she had refined. She had not just witnessed the work, she had contributed to it. A sharp knock sounded in her memory, not at the apartment door, but at her mind. Marcus's voice from earlier that evening. The phrasing he had used. The conceptual framing of his question. It had felt familiar in a way she had dismissed at first as coincidence. She turned another page. There. It was a paragraph outlining the relationship between inherited linguistic prestige and modern financial authority. The idea that those who mastered the language of elite systems could manipulate markets not through numbers alone, but through narrative. She felt her pulse quicken. At the restaurant, Marcus had referenced something similar, casually, as if it were common knowledge, but it wasn't. This work had never been published. Her father's thesis had remained unfinished, archived but not defended, trapped in academic limbo after the accident. Sarah had tried, briefly, to push it forward, to advocate for recognition, but without her father's ability to present it himself, the faculty had hesitated. Funding dried up, interest faded, the world moved on. She swallowed and reached for her phone. A quick search brought up dozens of articles about Marcus Sterling, interviews, profiles, headlines praising his intellect and innovation. She clicked on one at random, scanning past the predictable praise until a familiar phrase caught her eye. Language is the architecture of power, the article quoted him as saying. Markets respond not to truth, but to the narratives we construct around them. Her breath stopped. That sentence. It was almost identical. She flipped back to the thesis, her fingers trembling now despite her effort to remain calm. There, in her father's careful handwriting, was a line that mirrored it nearly word for word. The architecture metaphor, the connection between narrative and capital flow. This was not inspiration. It was replication. No, she whispered. Her father's eyes widened slightly. Tracking her movements, she read more articles, watched a short video clip of Marcus delivering a keynote speech at a financial summit. He stood on stage in a tailored suit, speaking confidently about linguistic frameworks in economic modeling. The audience hung on his words. Applause followed every rhetorical flourish. He spoke about ideas that had once lived exclusively in this small, quiet room. Her vision blurred for a moment, but she forced herself to focus. She returned to the thesis, cross-referencing terminology, structure, even the order of argumentation. The parallels multiplied. He had not simply borrowed a concept, he had built an empire on it. Her chest tightened with something sharper than anger. Betrayal implied personal connection. This was colder, more clinical. A realization that what had been taken was not just intellectual property, but legacy. Her father's breathing remained steady, but his eyes burned with a new intensity. He understood. He saw it unfolding in her expression. They thought you were finished, she said softly, her voice trembling despite her restraint. They thought no one would notice. She looked at him, really looked at him. At the man who had once commanded rooms larger than the restaurant where she now carried plates. At the mind that had shaped her own. You were never irrelevant, she whispered. A tear slid down her cheek before she could stop it. She wiped it away quickly, angry at herself for the loss of control. This was not the time for emotion. This was the time for clarity. She gathered the papers carefully, stacking them in order, noting dates, annotations, faculty signatures. She opened more articles, saving them, comparing language. The evidence was not yet proof in a legal sense, but it was undeniable in substance. Marcus Sterling had not recognized her at the restaurant. He had not needed to to him. The thesis had likely been an abandoned relic, something discovered in an archive or referenced in private academic circles, unattributed and unprotected. An idea waiting to be claimed. He had claimed it, and tonight, without knowing it, he had used it against the daughter of the man who created it. Sarah leaned back in her chair, exhaustion washing over her in waves. The quiet weight she carried every day had shifted again, heavier now but different. It was no longer just survival. It was reckoning. She looked at her father, whose gaze had not left her face. "I won't let him keep it," she said, the words forming slowly but with iron beneath them. "I won't let him pretend it was his." Her father's fingers moved again. A small, deliberate motion against the blanket. Yes, the room felt smaller suddenly, charged with something electric and dangerous. The past she had tried so hard to bury had clawed its way back to the surface, demanding acknowledgement. Outside, a car passed, headlights sweeping briefly across the walls before disappearing. The city continued unaware. Sarah gathered Marcus's card from the desk and stared at it. Curiosity had brought him closer. Now truth would pull him back, and this time, she would not answer as a waitress. She would answer as her father's daughter. She would answer as her father's daughter. The words did not feel dramatic. They felt inevitable. Sarah didn't sleep. The city moved through the hours in hushed transitions, midnight to 2 to 4, while she sat at the small kitchen table beneath the dim overhead light, surrounded by stacks of paper that no longer looked like relics. They looked like evidence. Marcus Sterling's business card lay at the center, white and immaculate, his name embossed in restrained silver. Beneath it, the articles she had printed from her phone's wireless connection formed a second pile. Quotes highlighted, phrases circled, dates noted in the margins. She worked methodically. Emotion could wait. At 4:30 in the morning, she found it. An academic conference program from 8 years ago, tucked between correspondence from the Sorbonne's economics department. The topic: linguistic capital and emerging markets. Guest sponsors, listed corporate donors. One name stood out: Sterling Global Holdings. Her pulse steadied, not quickened. That was how clarity felt. Cold, precise. Marcus hadn't stumbled upon the ideas by accident. He had funded the room where they were discussed. She closed her eyes briefly. Her father had presented preliminary findings at that conference. She remembered the night before how he paced the apartment, rehearsing lines in French and English, refining metaphors, insisting that ideas deserved elegance. She had been 20, sitting cross-legged on the floor, offering minor edits with shy confidence. The next morning, he had worn his best suit. 2 weeks later, the accident happened. And somewhere, between applause and silence, someone had been listening very carefully. The sky outside began to pale. Sarah rose, gathered the documents into a neat folder and slid it into her bag. She walked into her father's room. He was awake, watching the window as dawn softened the edges of the buildings. "I'm going to call him," she said quietly. His eyes shifted to her. "I won't accuse him," she added. "Not yet, because accusation without strategy was surrender." She stepped into the hallway and dialed the number. It rang twice. Sterling's office. The voice was female. Crisp. Efficient. "This is Sarah Bennett," she said evenly. "I'm calling regarding an invitation Mr. Sterling extended to me last evening." A pause. Keyboard typing in the background. "Yes, Miss Bennett. Mr. Sterling anticipated your call." "Of course he did. He would be pleased to host you at a private dinner this evening. 8 o'clock. The Marceau House. The Marceau House. One of the most exclusive private dining clubs in Paris. Membership by invitation only. No press. No cameras. Conversations there shaped industries." "I'll be there," Sarah replied. She ended the call and stood still for a moment, the quiet pressing against her ribs. He anticipated your call. Marcus Sterling did nothing casually. That meant he had been intrigued. Good. Let him be curious. The day passed in fragments. She worked her shift at the restaurant with the same composure as always, her movements efficient, her tone respectful. But beneath the routine, her mind ran simulations. What would he say? Would he deny it outright? Would he attempt charm? Men like Marcus rarely admitted theft. They reframed it. They called it acquisition, innovation, evolution of thought. At 6, she returned home. She stood in front of her small wardrobe, studying the limited options. Her waitress uniform hung on the inside of the door. Beside it 2 dresses, one simple black, one navy with a high collar. She chose the navy. Not because it was impressive. Because it was understated. She styled her hair with deliberate simplicity and applied minimal makeup. No attempt to compete with the polished socialites who would likely frequent a place like Marceau. She would not perform wealth. She would perform intellect. Before leaving, she stepped into her father's room once more. "He thinks this is another game," she said softly. "He thinks I'm interesting." Her father's gaze held her steadily. "He doesn't know yet." A faint tremor moved through his hand. Encouragement. She leaned down and pressed her forehead gently to his. "I'm not afraid," she whispered. And she realized it was true. The Marceau house stood behind wrought iron gates, discreet and immaculate. A valet approached as her taxi pulled up. She stepped out, giving her name with calm precision. Inside, the lighting was warm but controlled, illuminating marble floors and dark wood paneling. The air carried the faint scent of aged wine and polished leather. Conversations were muted, intentional. Power did not shout here. It murmured. A maitre d' approached. "Miss Bennett, Mr. Sterling is expecting you." Of course he was. She was led through the main dining room toward a more secluded chamber at the back. The door opened. Marcus stood near a floor-to-ceiling window overlooking the Seine, hands clasped behind his back. He turned as she entered. For a fraction of a second, something unreadable crossed his face. Approval. Not of her beauty. Of her composure. "Miss Bennett," he said smoothly. "You came. You invited me." A faint smile curved his lips. "I was hoping you would." The table was set for 2. Crystal. Silver. Precision in every detail. He pulled out her chair. She sat without hesitation. Wine was poured. She didn't touch it. "I've been thinking about you," Marcus began, settling into his seat across from her. "I doubt that," she replied calmly. His smile widened slightly. "You surprise me." "I don't intend to." The first course arrived. Neither of them acknowledged it immediately. "I value intelligence," Marcus said. "It's rare. Especially paired with restraint." "You mistake restraint for lack of options." A flicker again. Interest sharpening. "I prefer women who understand power," he continued. "And I prefer men who understand originality." There it was. The air shifted. He leaned back slightly, studying her more closely now. That's an interesting choice of word, is it? She asked evenly. Originality? Silence stretched between them, not uncomfortable but charged. He set his fork down carefully. You didn't come here for dinner, he said at last. No, then why did you come? She reached into her bag and withdrew the folder, placing it gently on the table between them. She didn't open it yet. I came to ask you a question. His gaze dropped briefly to the folder, then returned to her face. What question? She held his eyes. Do you remember the Sorbonne conference on linguistic capital and emerging markets? It was subtle, but she saw it. The smallest pause in his breathing. The faint tightening at the corner of his jaw. Yes, he said smoothly. I sponsor many academic initiatives. I'm sure you do. She opened the folder now, turning it so he could see the first page. Her father's name printed clearly beneath the university crest. Professor Elaine Bennett. Marcus's expression did not crumble, but it hardened. You've built an extraordinary empire, she continued, her voice steady and low. On a very specific framework. He didn't interrupt. You once said that language is the architecture of power, she added quietly. That markets respond not to truth, but to narrative. His eyes locked onto hers. And I'm wondering, she finished, when you first decided those words were yours. The room felt smaller. The muted hum of distant conversations beyond the private chamber faded into insignificance. There was only the space between them now, filled with something far more dangerous than humiliation. Recognition. Marcus did not look away. But for the first time since she had met him, he was no longer entirely in control of the narrative. Marcus Sterling did not blink. He did not laugh either. The faintest sound in the room was the settling of crystal against linen as a distant table shifted. A reminder that the world outside their confrontation continued to spin in polite ignorance. But inside that private chamber overlooking the Seine, time narrowed. It thinned to a single, fragile thread stretched between accusation and response. When you first decided those words were yours, Sarah's voice had not risen. It hadn't trembled. She had not sharpened it into a weapon. She had simply laid it down, like a fact waiting to be acknowledged. Marcus leaned back in his chair slowly, the motion deliberate. His gaze moved from the document bearing Professor Elaine Bennett's name to Sarah's face again, measuring, recalculating. You're suggesting, he said at last, each syllable carefully polished, that I built a multinational corporation on plagiarized academic theory? I'm suggesting, Sarah replied evenly, that the foundation of your public philosophy mirrors my father's unpublished thesis with remarkable precision. Unpublished, he repeated. Yes, he allowed that word to linger, as though it weakened her argument, as though obscurity negated ownership. That's a serious claim, Marcus said. One that requires more than emotional inference. Good, she answered softly. Because I didn't bring emotion, she slid another page forward, an early draft of the thesis, dated and stamped. Marginal notes in her father's handwriting curved across the edges like quiet fingerprints. A paragraph circled in blue ink. Marcus's eyes flicked down. Sarah watched him read. She did not need to see the recognition bloom. She felt it in the subtle shift of his breathing. Language is not merely communication. It is currency. Control the narrative, and you control the market's perception of value. She spoke the next line aloud. Language is not merely communication, she said calmly. It is currency. Control the narrative, and you control the market's perception of value. Marcus's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. That phrase appears, she continued, nearly verbatim in your keynote address at the Global Finance Summit 5 years ago. Silence. not denial. Not yet. He folded his hands together on the table. His composure remained intact, but it was no longer effortless. It was constructed. Do you know, he said quietly, how many economists explore similar concepts? Narrative economics isn't exclusive to your father. No, she agreed. It isn't. She reached into the folder again and withdrew a second sheet. But this structure is, she outlined it with her finger. A framework divided into 3 tiers: linguistic influence, market perception, behavioral reinforcement. A triangular model annotated with examples specific to emerging post-colonial economies. Marcus's company had branded it differently. The Sterling Triad. Same architecture. Different label. He looked at the page longer this time. The waiter entered discreetly with the second course. Neither of them acknowledged him. The plates were placed. The door closed again. The scent of truffle and seared duck drifted into the space, absurdly luxurious against the weight of what lay between them. You're intelligent, Marcus said finally. I'll give you that. I didn't come for compliments. And I didn't come for a trial. No, she said softly. You invited me for entertainment. A flicker of irritation crossed his features. Brief. Controlled. You think I needed to steal from an obscure academic? He asked. I think you were in the room, Sarah replied. And I think you recognized brilliance when you heard it. His eyes sharpened. You admire me, he said quietly. It wasn't a question. She almost smiled. No, she answered. I recognize you. The difference hung in the air. Marcus stood slowly and walked toward the window, hands slipping into his pockets. Outside, the river reflected city lights like fractured constellations. He stared at them as if searching for alignment. You're right about one thing, he said after a moment. I was at that conference. Sarah's pulse remained steady. My firm sponsored it, he continued. I attended out of obligation. Academic theory rarely translates into profitable strategy. And yet, she murmured. And yet, he echoed, turning slightly, your father's presentation was compelling. The word seemed chosen reluctantly. He spoke with conviction, Marcus went on. Not the abstract attachment most scholars cling to. He understood that language could destabilize entire industries. He understood integrity, Sarah said quietly. Marcus's gaze hardened again. Integrity doesn't build empires, he replied. No, she agreed. It builds legacies. The distinction landed. He returned to the table, but he did not sit immediately. You're implying I appropriated his framework intentionally. I'm asking you when you decided it belonged to you. There it was again, that steady refusal to escalate. She was not pleading, not threatening, simply holding a mirror. Marcus exhaled through his nose, slow and measured. You want a confession, he said. I want truth, truth, he repeated, as if testing the weight of it. He pulled out his chair and sat down, leaning forward slightly now. Closer, more direct. After that conference, he said, I requested a copy of his paper. Sarah's breath stilled. He declined. Marcus continued. Said it wasn't ready. That it required refinement. It did, she replied. Marcus nodded once. A week later, my office received an envelope. Her mind sharpened instantly. From him? No return address. The words shifted something in her chest. What was inside? She asked quietly. A partial draft. Notes. The structural outline. Sarah felt the ground tilt. That's impossible, she said. The first fracture in her composure. Marcus watched her carefully. I assumed he reconsidered. He continued. Academics often resist collaboration until they realize the scale of implementation available through private funding. he wouldn't have sent it, she insisted. Not without conditions. I had no conditions, Marcus said flatly. No signature. No contract. The air between them thickened. Sarah's thoughts raced not chaotically, but with precise urgency. Her father had guarded his work obsessively. He believed in publication ethics, in credit, in citation. He would not have mailed an unprotected draft to a corporation without negotiation. Unless her mind flicked back to that period. The days before the accident. The tension in the apartment. The late-night phone calls he took in the hallway. Who else was in that room? She asked suddenly. Marcus's expression shifted almost imperceptibly. At the conference? Yes, he hesitated. A fraction too long. Several sponsors. Department heads. A venture capital consultant. Name. He studied her for a moment. Victor Hale. The name struck like distant thunder. Sarah's memory unspooled. Victor Hale had visited their apartment once. She had opened the door. He'd worn an expensive coat and carried the scent of ambition like cologne. He had spoken to her father in low, persuasive tones about partnerships, about accelerating impact. Her father had declined, politely, firmly. The next week, the accident happened. A collision at an intersection. A truck that ran a red light. Driver unidentified. The case unsolved. Marcus was still watching her. You didn't know about Hale? She asked. No, Marcus said. He facilitated the sponsorship. That's all. Did he profit from your adoption of the framework? Marcus's silence answered more clearly than words. A realization began to take shape slow, terrible. You paid him, she said. For strategic consultation, Marcus replied. Yes, and he delivered my father's work. Marcus did not confirm it. He didn't need to. The pieces aligned with brutal clarity. Victor Hale had access. He had motive. He had proximity. Marcus had ambition. He had capital. He had opportunity. But theft required a bridge. And Victor Hale had been that bridge. Sarah's composure returned not as calm, but as resolve. You built your empire on a stolen foundation, she said quietly. Whether you orchestrated it or not. Marcus's jaw tightened. I built my empire on execution, he countered. Ideas are worthless without implementation. Not worthless, she said. Vulnerable. Silence settled again, heavier now. You could destroy me with this, he said finally. It wasn't fear in his voice. It was assessment. Sarah looked at him steadily. I could, she agreed. The admission did not feel triumphant. It felt like standing at the edge of something vast and irreversible. But I didn't come here to destroy you, she added. Marcus's eyes narrowed slightly. Then why are you here, Miss Bennett? She closed the folder gently. Because my father cannot defend himself. Her voice softened, not weak, but grounded in something unshakable. And because I want to know whether you are the kind of man who will. For the first time since the conversation began, Marcus Sterling did not have an immediate answer. Outside, the river continued its steady flow beneath the city lights. Inside, the fault line between them had opened fully, and neither of them could step back across it unchanged.
Marcus Sterling had negotiated billion-dollar. Marcus Sterling had negotiated billion-dollar mergers without breaking eye contact. He had dismantled competitors in boardrooms where seasoned executives left with carefully concealed panic beneath their tailored suits. He understood leverage the way musicians understood tempo. He felt it, measured it, applied it with precision. But this was different. because this time the leverage wasn't financial, it was moral. And because I want to know whether you are the kind of man who will. Sarah's words did not echo in the room. They didn't need to. They settled into the space between them like a verdict waiting for confirmation. Marcus did not answer immediately. He looked at her, not as a waitress now, not as an amusing anomaly from the previous night, but as an equal adversary. Or perhaps something more dangerous than an adversary. A witness. "You're asking me to admit liability," he said at last, voice low and controlled. "I'm asking you to acknowledge responsibility. There's a difference." "Yes," she replied calmly. "There is." Responsibility implied choice. Liability implied punishment. Marcus leaned back in his chair slowly, exhaling through his nose as though recalibrating a strategy mid-game. "You believe Victor Hale stole the draft," he said. "I know my father didn't give it away." "And you believe I benefited from that theft." "You did?" Not accusatory, not dramatic, just factual. The quiet confidence in her tone unsettled him more than outrage would have. He studied her face carefully, searching for desperation, for a hidden agenda, for ambition disguised as righteousness. He found none. "What do you want?" he asked finally. There it was, the question every powerful man eventually asked when confronted with truth. "What's the price?" Sarah didn't answer immediately. She let the silence stretch, not as manipulation, but as deliberation, because she had thought about this all day, all night. "I want his name restored," she said. Marcus's brow lifted slightly. "You're aware that accusing Hale publicly would implicate my firm?" "Yes." "And you're aware that if this becomes scandal, shareholders will demand explanations?" "Yes." "And that explanation will include the admission that the intellectual framework behind Sterling Global originated with your father?" "Yes." He watched her closely. "You're asking me to undermine my own credibility?" "No," she corrected softly. "I'm asking you to anchor it in truth." His jaw flexed. "Truth doesn't stabilize markets," he replied. "Confidence does." "And what happens when confidence is built on something fragile?" she asked. He didn't answer. Because he knew. Confidence built on a lie doesn't collapse immediately. It expands, it thrives, it attracts investment, admiration, power. Until the fault line is exposed, then it implodes. "You could go to the press," Marcus said carefully. "Leak the documents, force a narrative." "I could, but you didn't." "No." "Why?" She held his gaze steadily. "Because I don't want spectacle," she said. "I want justice." The word hung between them, heavier than any threat. Justice. Not revenge. Not money. Not fame. Justice. Marcus stood again, restless energy now threading through his controlled exterior. He walked to the window once more, looking down at the dark ribbon of the Seine, as if it might offer strategic clarity. "You understand the risk," he said without turning. If I acknowledge this publicly, Hale won't fall alone. I know. He'll defend himself. Let him. He'll claim your father sold it, or that it was collaborative. My father documented everything. Marcus turned slightly. And if he drags your father's name through litigation, depositions, media scrutiny, speculation about an accident that was never resolved. Sarah felt the sharp edge of that possibility, but she didn't flinch. My father has already lost his voice, she said quietly. You cannot threaten me with silence. That landed. Marcus turned fully now, facing her. You're formidable, he said. She didn't respond. You could have asked for money, he continued. A settlement, a trust fund, security. My father didn't teach me to negotiate integrity. And what did he teach you? That power without ethics is instability in disguise. Marcus's eyes darkened slightly at that. He returned to the table and rested both hands on its edge, leaning forward. If I do this, he said slowly, it will not be small. It will be surgical. She waited. I will commission an internal review of the original acquisition of the framework. Independent auditors, legal oversight. And if misconduct is found, Hale will be prosecuted. And my father, Marcus inhaled deeply. I will publicly acknowledge Professor Sarah Bennett as the intellectual originator of the model. Retroactive credit, academic publication funded in his name, royalties allocated to him and his estate. Estate, the W.O. The next day arrived heavy with tension, as if the city itself sensed that something irreversible was about to happen. Markets opened, screens lit up, analysts spoke with practiced confidence, unaware that a single decision would soon ripple through every conversation. Sarah had not slept. She sat beside her father as morning light filtered through the thin curtains, her phone resting in her palm. He was awake, his eyes searching hers, as they always did when something important was unfolding. She told him she had spoken to Marcus Sterling, that the truth had finally been placed in front of someone powerful enough to act on it. By mid-afternoon, Sterling Global issued an unexpected announcement. An emergency executive briefing, mandatory attendance. Speculation spread quickly, but no one yet understood what was coming. At precisely 3 o'clock, Marcus entered the boardroom. Calm, unadorned. He spoke without notes, his voice steady as he acknowledged what had been hidden for years. The firm's celebrated strategic model, he said, originated not within Sterling Global, but with Professor Sarah Bennett of the Sorbonne. An internal investigation was being launched. Accountability would follow, credit would be restored. Shock moved through the room, but Marcus did not retreat. He framed the admission not as collapse, but as correction. Transparency over concealment. Truth before reputation. Within minutes, headlines ignited across financial networks. Victor Hale's name surfaced. Access revoked. Lawyers mobilized. The past, long buried, had finally caught up. In the quiet apartment near the river, Sarah refreshed the newsfeed again and again. She watched Marcus speak at a press conference, cameras flashing as he repeated her father's name aloud. Professor Alain Bennett. Not as a footnote, not as an afterthought, as the source. Her father's eyes filled with tears. He could not speak, but he did not need to. His life's work had been returned to him, not through noise or scandal, but through recognition. Weeks later, at a modest ceremony at the Sorbonne, the auditorium rose in applause as his research was formally unveiled under his own name. Sarah stood beside him, steady and proud. Marcus watched from the audience, not seeking attention, understanding at last that power did not weaken when credit was shared. As the applause faded, Sarah felt no triumph, only restoration. Names mattered. Words mattered. And sometimes when power tried to humiliate, it awakened something far more dangerous than rebellion. Truth, spoken fluently,